We're talking today in International Economics 210 about tariffs. And tariffs are often considered one type of trade protection. Tariffs are taxes placed on imports. Why? Why does a country place taxes on imports? It might be protection. And here, economists don't always explain both reasons that a country might use protection. Economists are often very heavy on describing protection of industries. So the idea might be that even though the United States no longer has comparative advantage in small electronics, we might want a small electronics industry just to keep workers earning a good wage. And so we might put protection on small electronics. The one that's not so common, but needs to be considered, is when we might do protection to keep what we consider an essential industry. Two examples I would give are defense and agriculture. In the defense case, obviously, we would be wanting to have an industry so that American weapons are produced in the United States in case at some future time when we were in a conflict, a foreign company might no longer supply us. And in the area of agriculture, this country has had periods, granted they were long ago, where people actually starved to death because there wasn't enough production in the country. The Dust Bowl situation of the 1930s comes to mind. So we might just want to make sure we have enough food. Another reason that a government could do protection is to raise revenue for that government. There are two specific types of tariffs. One is what we call a specific tax, and this is a tax per unit. This is hard to administer, and this might be something like every bushel of wheat we have a $2 tariff. Also, tariffs and the more common type are ad valorem. And ad valorem means that the tariff is set at a certain percentage of the value of the import. Here are some common tariffs, just a few of them. First, and these were tariffs that were described in Business Insider and through the International Trade Commission as recently as 2010. There's a 20% tariff on vegetables. And the reason, you might imagine, is the protection of the food supply. If you go back to the previous slide, this would be the protection of necessities. There's a 23% tariff on gloves. You might argue that the reason for this tariff is protection of the U.S. industry. And then look at the third item, tobacco, 350% tariff. Here, the most likely reason is twofold, both to discourage consumption so that U.S. consumers don't buy any tobacco, but also protection of the American tobacco industry so that if, heaven forbid, people are going to continue to smoke, they'll smoke American cigarettes. These two graphs look at the tariff from the perspective of the U.S. consumer and both U.S. and domestic producers. So in this example, looking at the consumer surplus graph first. Now when you're looking at these, the first thing you have to remember is that this is a standard supply and demand curve. So we have price on the vertical axis. We have quantity on the horizontal axis. We have equilibrium as the normal point where suppliers and consumers would meet at a mutually acceptable price. So that's a review from Econ 201 or Econ 202. Notice that at general equilibrium in consumer surplus, on the consumer surplus side of the charts, we have a standard supply and demand graph, and initially the entire red and the entire green, all of this area from $20 a pair of gloves up, is consumer surplus. So I did pick gloves to look at, and if you remember, gloves are sort of the classic of the three actual tariffs I mentioned earlier that the United States puts on imported products. Gloves are the ones that are pretty definitely to protect the U.S. industry. So if there were no protection, what you would read here is that suppliers and consumers would meet at a price of about $20 for a pair of gloves. All the area under the demand curve and above $20, so that entire pink and or red and entire green, represents areas where some consumers would be willing to pay more than they're actually having to pay. For example, so where I plot my finger down here, you might have a consumer willing to spend $30 or $35. They don't have to. They can spend less. So that they were willing to spend, let's say, $32, $33 and only had to spend $20 means they have a surplus. They have a benefit. Well, what the consumer surplus graph shows is that if there's a tariff of 23%, and we learned earlier that there is, this raises the domestic price from $20 a pair to $24.60. So when the price raises, consumer surplus shrinks. This area in the red is no longer available to consumers. Consumers still have a surplus between $24.60 and whatever this top price is here, might be $40, but no longer do they enjoy the area of consumer surplus between $20 and $24.60. Notice then, the person that was willing to pay $32 still has a surplus, a consumer surplus between $32 and $24.60, but a consumer that would have spent $23 had a consumer surplus before, but no longer has one. The key at the bottom just shows that the red is former U.S. consumer surplus that, with a tariff, is now given to U.S. producers. And keep that in mind, tariff taken from U.S. consumers, given to U.S. producers, and we'll talk in a minute about how that happens. And then green is the remaining surplus to U.S. consumers. Take a look at the producer surplus graph beside this. So here, at a price of $20, the green represented original producer surplus. And at a price of $20, this tiny writing that you may or may not be able to read is that few, if any, U.S. producers were able to successfully produce gloves at $20 a pair. So most of the green surplus went to producers. However, when the price is forced up to $24.60, because remember, U.S. producers don't have to pay the tariff. Now U.S. producers can compete. And so the whole red area becomes new producer surplus. So the new or final producer surplus is the entire green plus the entire red. The big thing to notice here is that the red producer surplus primarily goes to U.S. or domestic producers. And if you take the two charts together, or the two graphs together, consumers here have given their surplus, U.S. consumers, to U.S. producers. And this is a common theme we're going to have when discussing tariffs and other form of protection. Who are we more interested in helping? Are we more interested in helping U.S. consumers, in which case we won't do the red here in the producer surplus, and we won't have any domestic producers? Or Are we more interested in helping the producers? And if we are, we're going to go ahead and add the red surplus for them, and we're going to eat into the consumer surplus. So in essence, we're going to bill consumers to accommodate producers. Keep in mind then, economists generally think that you do not successfully put these tariffs on foreign producers or foreign governments. It's true that they have to pay them, but often in the end, American consumers subsidize American producers. Well, the graph is an interesting picture, but what is the amount of protection, the specific or actual amount of protection available because of a tariff? Well, that's not something we're studying in this video. Instead, the next lecture will focus on the effective rate of protection. And here, we're going to use a mathematical formula to try to figure out just how much protection was provided by a decision to impose tariffs. Take care, and let me know if you have questions.